How is everyone? I was hoping there'd be less of you here, less people to blush in front of. All right, well, let's get started. This research is something I did during my last year at the University of Oregon as an undergraduate. And it started because I was upset with the current analysis on TV about the Portland Trail Blazers. And what they were saying was that when we'd make the playoffs early on, when we had Brandon Roy and LaMarcus Aldridge, when they were real young, it's what they're outmatched by these veteran teams, and that's why we would lose these series ultimately. And the classic criticism now that you hear all over the league is, their youth and inexperience is not going to weigh. It's not going to work against a veteran team. And then when the young team wins, the story changes all of a sudden, and it's their youth and their athleticism that was allowed them to win. So they're saying, youth loses, then youth wins. It's complete lack of understanding. This is me trying to understand it. And you start with questions. That's what sports analytics allows us to do. It allows us to take these answers that we hold to be true and ask questions properly and investigate them. So what questions are there about experience? Well, you first need to ask, does experience affect winning? And what type of wins are we talking about? What types of experience are we talking about? Are we talking about regular season wins, postseason wins, winning late in the season, winning championships? Are we talking about player experience, coaching experience, team experience, front office experience, cumulative experience between players and coaches? There's all sorts of ways to represent it. Can you quantify it? How do you do it accurately? What's the value of experience? What are the implications to teams, players, and coaches? A lot of questions. I had to focus mine. My questions were simply, which forms of experience show a causal relationship to winning in the postseason? And what's the potential impact of those, of that relationship in terms of postseason wins? I'm a fan as well. I want the Blazers to win a championship, so I was interested in postseason wins. And because this is a first look at such a broad topic, I chose player, coach, and team experience levels, and I represented those in a variety of ways. By team experience, I mean, the classic way to think about it is with John Stockton and Karl Malone. This is how I usually explain it, is that we love the way they play basketball together. Stockton always knew where Malone would be on the floor, whether he was going to pop out for a jumper, whether he was going to roll to the basket, and he could deliver that ball exactly where Malone would be able to handle it effectively and finish at the basket. That type of chemistry of teammate knowledge exists between all teammates at differing levels, but we appreciate it and see it at the extreme values, in the extreme ways. So that's what I mean. I quantified how many years of experience teammates have amongst themselves. The data. I hand-gathered all this data, which took an excruciating amount of time, and which was one of my main limitations. I couldn't get at everything I wanted to because it took so much time and it was just me. But it covers 30 NBA seasons and has a cross-section across all active franchises during that period. And I represented player experience and coach experience divided into regular season experience and postseason experience. I represented player experience in the league by the average amount of regular seasons they've played in the league and how many postseason games they've played. All right? And similarly with coaches, head coaches only, I represented how many years they've coached in the NBA and how many postseason games they've coached in the NBA, not team specific in their whole career. All right? And when you're representing a team that's composed of players, I had to make a decision about how I was going to have my data represent teams. And I didn't want to choose an arbitrary amount of playing time to decide what players would make up my teams. And I ultimately decided to choose the top 5 regular season minute getters from each team because with my chemistry variable, with my team experience variable, I'm trying to represent who we're playing together. The data is only going to be effective at representing what it's trying to get at if those players are playing together on the court at the same time. And the way to get at that would be who's playing the most. Try to get at the starting 5. Also, I couldn't add another 15,000 data points, another 4 months to gather data. So, I also included variance in my player experience variables as well to control for the heterogeneity of teams. My analysis is drawn from 3 main regressions. The first one regresses the general sample on postseason wins. The second one, the general sample on regular season wins. And the third is a restricted sample, where the sample is restricted to only teams that won 1 or more playoff games. So I'm seeing how the variations in these variables behave in certain groups. And if you're going to make an argument for causality, it's certainly these statistics need to be statistically significant in regressions 1 and 3, certainly. Regression 2, as I'll get into later, it gives you more information and can tell a bigger story about why it might not be influential in winning the postseason. If I see evidence for causality, my next step was to apply sample statistics from my data and represent a mismatch. So basically a mock criticism. When they criticize teams for being inexperienced and undermatched, I want to see if that effect is true. If there is causality, I want to see if their criticism is actually impactful. If it's going to impact an estimated 1/10 of a postseason game, then it's not really a big deal. But if it can be represented by a game and a half and influence a series or half a game even, I mean, that's important, and we should know that. We should be able to confidently say that that's what's happening in the league. So my results: player NBA experience. So again, the number of years that the average number of years your starting 5 have been in the league, NBA seasons they've played. I found this to have a very weak correlation, statistically significant at 10% in the first regression, and not statistically significant in the third when you're talking about the variation of the variable amongst just playoff caliber teams. And what was interesting though about it, I couldn't be confident enough to say that it does cause a team to win postseason games. But what I could say, and what does make sense, is that it has a quadratic relationship to winning, just like player productivity does. When a player enters the league, he initially gets better, peaks at some point, his productivity falls with age until retirement. It's the same with players on your team producing wins with age. But again, it's not the statistical significance points to the ambiguity of the variable more than the can't be confident with it. Player postseason experience. Regression 1 estimated a massive effect of 1.76 differential between a highly experienced team and a poorly experienced team. That's to say, a team that had an average amount of 50 postseason games played relative to a team entering the playoffs for maybe the first time or the second time. And that was surprising. That is a massive effect just for experience. We're not even talking about performance variables. And what I ended up seeing was that in regression 3, when you're talking about the variable's effect among just playoffs teams, it's not significant at all. What you're seeing here is the effect of the variable allowing teams to win regular season games. If you think about what the data tells you, a player having postseason experience means he's good enough to get there. The team was good enough to play in playoff games. It doesn't tell you how they performed in those games. And that's the story this tells. And in regression 2, that's what it says. A highly experienced team is estimated to win 3.46 regular season games due to their postseason experience. That's gonna be crucial in a playoff race. It's gonna get you there. It's gonna get you at least 4 games. If you get 4 games, you're probably gonna win 1 or 2. Might get you further. And so that's where that high estimate is from regression 1 is coming from. Coach's experience. Coach's experience was represented similarly to the player, length of coaching career in years. I also used other variables like coach tenure, coach postseason winning percentage, coach regular season winning percentage as controls. Again, in the paper you get a lot more detail about it. But my conclusions were that coach NBA experience has nothing to do with winning in the postseason. How long a coach has coached in the NBA is not going to help your team win more. It's more important what they did during those years. And when it says coaches do not improve with failure, that's the true conclusion, because it's holding coaches' postseason games coach constant as a control. So if you give a coach an extra year of coaching and hold his postseason games coach constant, it means he didn't make the playoffs because he didn't coach any more in the postseason. So a failed year of coaching is not correlated with any more wins in the postseason, if that makes sense. Hopefully it does. Coach postseason experience. This, on the other hand, was interesting. I did find that coaching in the postseason is correlated with winning in the postseason. Specifically, if you have any, I used a dummy variable for that, if you have any coaching experience in the postseason, it'd be correlated with 2/3 of a win, which is pretty big just for having a coach who's been there before. And furthermore, it's also estimated that a per game basis too, but that relationship will break down at higher levels, but it says 0.014 is the correlation coefficient. So per game of postseason experience your coach has, it estimates that you will win 0.014 postseason games per year. Chemistry, the teammate experience level. This was interesting. This was significant at the 5% level in both regressions 1 and 3, and the estimate held. Meaning it was consistent. It didn't matter what sample the variable was being regressed in. And there was a massive differential. Players that have played together with each other for a long time. So if you have a team that's hung in there and stuck together like the Utah Jazz did over years, they can expect to win 1.6 to more postseason games that year than a team who has been broken up, or the players are in their first or second year playing with one another. It speaks a lot to how teams make transactions. It says what to value in your player. When you trade a player, you're not trading just him and his skills. You're trading everything he knows about his teammates and that his teammates know about him. The player that's going to replace him is unfamiliar with his new teammates, and they're unfamiliar about him. So if you're thinking about making a short-term transaction, this chemistry variable is very important. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the answers in brief, what I found out. Player NBA experience, length of how long you played in the league, not going to matter when you're getting to the league. I can't draw a conclusion there. Player postseason experience, certainly not. It might get you into the playoffs. It's not going to get you wins in the playoffs. These guys have been playing at the highest levels of competition in their age group their entire life. There's no reason to believe that once they make the NBA playoffs, they're going to suddenly perform differently. Coaches' NBA experience. Again, length of coaching career, number of years, not relevant. Jerry Sloan, longtime coach, not important. What is important? Went to the playoffs a lot. Coached a lot in the playoffs. That's something you might cite, you might value. Do not value the length of a coach's playing career, or coaching career. And chemistry. It's correlated with, we should talk about that. It's an estimated 0.56 more wins the next season if you keep your team intact. Because if you keep your starting five intact between seasons, you're going to gain 10 years of cumulative experience between those players, right? And that's correlated with 0.56 or 0.6 postseason wins, depending if you use the estimate from regression 1 or regression 3. All right. So relevance of these results. To just analysts and fans, it's real information. It's not just an assumption that experience is always better than inexperience. That's why we're here. We now have the ability to find out for ourselves. I mean, as a college student who could just, find out things that I found wrong about the sports world. To franchises, it's better information on what to value. When you're looking at a coach, again, you want to look at what he's done in the playoffs if you're talking about postseason wins. You don't care about how long he's coached in the league. And when you're talking about players, you don't care how long they've been in the NBA. You care about how long they've played with their current players. And you might care what they've done with the postseason experience they've had, but not whether they have any or not. That's some future research I plan on doing, though. It also says patience, chemistry. Chemistry is dependent on keeping your team together. It's an incentive to keep your team together. It's a disincentive to make transactions. Keeping your team together is going to allow them to improve as a unit. Players improve in the offseason. This data suggests teams improve in the offseason as well. We knew that, but we didn't know how much. And chemistry is a disincentive to make short-term transactions. The The most applicable way to use this data and these findings is in analyzing short-term transactions. And that we're seeing a lot of older players move to a contender for 1 or 2 years trying to sneak in a title at the end of their career. And when you do that, they're replacing somebody potentially who has been on that team for a long time and knows their teammates really well. And if you're just going to add that player for 1 or 2 years, they're not going to be able to recoup all that teammate experience that they're losing, that they're replacing. And so it's just a piece of the puzzle you can add into that analysis. But more research needs to be done in order to make that reliable and very, very accurate. And that's what it offers analytics. When you answer questions, usually it leads you to more. And the questions that I have involve when you add a new player to a team, how much does it affect his new teammates' productivity? How much does it affect his new productivity, the team's productivity, and how quickly does it improve? Does it come back to their best level? You know? There's fine reason to believe that there's diminishing returns to how well you know your teammates. Karl Malone and John Stockton got better, a lot better over the first 1 or 2 years playing together than they did, their last 2. So the NBA, this research is actually part of a senior thesis I wrote, and that was about competitive balance in the NBA. And how am I doing on time? I'm good? Okay. Man, it went by fast. Competitive balance in the NBA, and I can touch on it, I guess, if I have time. What happens at the end of every season, the champions have the luxury of satisfaction. They're the world champs, right? Why would they move their players around? They shouldn't, is what this says. Keep your team together, especially if you're the world champs. But what happens is everybody else they don't have the luxury of satisfaction. Their instinct says, I need to make moves. Fan pressure says, I need to make moves. I want to see new players out there. I want to generate some money and some fan interest and sell those tickets. And 2/3 of all teams that don't win the NBA championship make a major roster change, at least one. And that's decreasing their team chemistry significantly and diminishing their next year's expectations on winning postseason games. It suggests you need to be patient. But yeah, there's an inverse relationship between postseason success and your team's chemistry, your team's teammate experience. I'm sorry. Anyways, there's a lot more to it than that. If you'd like, you can ask me about it. I can email it to you. But that would be another presentation. Thanks, you guys, for coming out. I hope that wasn't too bad. If you have any questions, please step up to the microphone. We got maybe a few extra minutes, but 5 to 10. There's a lot I couldn't or didn't touch on, so please ask if you have any questions. Yes?
Hi. So I get that chemistry is good, chemistry adds wins. And I think I understood that you have 3 samples, and so it was significant for every sample, right? So chemistry added regular season wins and postseason wins. No?
Good question. I was something I skipped over. It was insignificant when regressed against regular season wins.
Okay. Well, that was actually my big question, because I was thinking, well, chemistry is good and chemistry adds wins, but does it add more wins in the postseason? And by definition, you're saying, in fact, it's confined to the postseason.
Right.
So that's interesting.
Yeah. And my conclusions about that were that the variable is an inaccurate descriptor of an 82-game regular season. Throughout the regular season, the lineups are changing consistently as coaches experiment with different lineups and distributions of playing time, and players have less incentive to come back from injuries for 1 out of an 82-game regular season rather than Game 6 of conference finals. And so the variable really is only is going to have a visible effect when those players are on the court playing together, and that's going to be most often in the playoffs. And that was one of the weaknesses of the variable, is that it is a proxy, right? I'm trying to get at team chemistry or teammate experience, but you can't quantify it perfectly. if that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting. I mean, certainly, I think bettors would be interested in this information because I don't know how teams are really regarded once they get into the postseason. But I would think that the regular season performance would be kind of the important variable for that. You're saying there's sort of found a sort of sleeper effect for teams once they get into the postseason. That with the chemistry, they're kind of outperforming what they did during the regular season.
No, I don't interpret it that way. I interpret it that the variable is simply, it's not an accurate descriptor. The players aren't playing together enough during the regular season for it to have a statistically significant correlation when regressing against regular season wins.
Okay, I'll think about it. I would think that teams with chemistry would be really undervalued by the public once we get to the postseason. Undervalued by the public and correctly valued by you. You have this insight of the value of chemistry.
Yeah. I think we should probably move on to the next question. I'd love to talk to you afterwards, though. Thank you. Yes?
Hi, I'm just having a trouble believing the causal relationship in the variables. I was wondering what you think about causality to explain some of the results. For example, with coaches, you could imagine that better coaches end up seeking out jobs with better teams because they can have their choice. Or with your Stockton-Malone example, maybe the Jazz weren't good because they kept them together, but rather they kept them together because they did well together.
Absolutely. And I didn't cover this as well. Each regression controlled for team performance with a lag-dependent variable. So the last year's performance, the quality of the team, was controlled for. And as far as quality of the team, I don't offer the per game estimate of 0.014 postseason wins per year or per game of post games coached as confident. That's going to break down at a higher level, like with coaches like Jerry Sloan or Phil Jackson. These guys have coached over 100, 200 postseason games. What's important is the dummy variable, and that is very simple. That is, do they have or do they not have postseason experience? And that has nothing to do with whether they're on a great team or a mediocre team.
So I'm going to hit on that causality point also. With team chemistry, you're controlling for lag performance. So you're saying, let me take two teams that look like they did the same. The team that made an off-season change does worse than the other team that looked similar last year. And you interpret that as a causal relationship of chemistry, which it absolutely could be. But if that coach is making a change because the counterfactual is worse, so I'm taking a guy out of the lineup that I know his performance has deteriorated significantly, or I have a player who's been injured this year and I have to get rid of him. So if I don't make a move, I'm actually going to be much worse than making a move. So I'm making a move to bring me up, but I know that there is some causal relationship, but you're picking up a selection effect of an unobservable bad event happening. So even conditional number of wins, there's this unobservable bad thing that's happened to the team that's correlated with making a move that would then bias this chemistry coefficient. So how can you be confident that there's not something observable to the coach, but not observable to you looking at win percentage? And that affects decision making. It affects the decision to make a move, which then might lead to lower performance next year, but is also correlated, obviously, by construction with the team composition.
Right. So what would you suggest I would try and control for in order to get rid of that bias?
Oh, I mean, I think you've done a good job of controlling for what you can observe and what's in the data. I would say, in stating your conclusions, you would say there's possible. I mean, anytime you're dealing with human actors, you're saying this organization is making decisions, and they're not making decisions randomly. And so when I do see a decision being made to switch the team up, the counterfactual might have been that they would have done a lot worse had they not made the move. The ideal is to keep the team together.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So but your estimate of chemistry is picking up both a selection effect and a potential causal relationship.
Right. That's why I don't conclude. I don't say there is a causal relationship. I'm saying I have evidence that there is, and it is a proxy, so it might be overstated. There might be a little bias in there, but like you said, I am picking up a causal relationship.
Right.
I believe it might.
Yeah. No.
The things I can't control for, absolutely, I agree with you. But by controlling for team performance, I believe most of that's taken care of.
Right. So, I mean, the only things, maybe you could put other things that might affect coach decision making, like the age structure of his team, specific injuries, you could look at specific cases, but no, I'm just, you know.
Oh,
that's
yeah,
Just
absolutely.
pushing back against a little bit the causal interpretation. But
No, absolutely.
thanks, good answer.
Thanks.
Can you talk about how you think this applies to college basketball? So if you're advising a college coach,
Sorry.
would you say, you know, go after the one and done player, or how much less talent would you agree to take on to have somebody stick around for 4 years?
I think that the college game is so much different than the pro game that you would need a whole new study to even begin to answer that question. Just like a regular season game in the NBA is much different than a playoff game. But it's a very interesting question. Thanks, Jess.